The summer of 1942 was especially difficult. The German offensive in the south was gaining momentum, and the entire front line, like a taut string, trembled with tension. In the headquarters of the Southwestern Front, amidst maps, telegrams, and smoking cigarettes, one name was heard more and more often: General Alexei Dmitrievich Kovalev. Tall and gray-haired with a piercing gaze, he wore no medals on his daily uniform, disliked honors, and preferred to stay in the shadows. But even the marshals knew that if Kovalev suspected something, it wasn't just an empty guess. In June, the headquarters received a series of reports about strange breaches in the defense. The Germans were striking in places where it seemed they couldn't possibly know the weak points. Field commanders were lost in speculation, but Kovalev just squinted grimly and flipped through radio intercepts. "We have a mole," he said one day to his adjutant, Captain Smirnov. "Someone on our side is feeding Hitler our plans." The captain just nodded silently. He knew that if the general said it, it was true. And if so, the hunt would begin. Kovalev didn't call in counterintelligence. He knew that the more people involved, the higher the chance the mole would slip away. He preferred to act alone, methodically, like a surgeon excising a tumor. He began with an analysis of all radio intercepts from the last 2 months, all troop movements, every change in tactics, every logistical failure. In a special file, he kept a journal where he recorded the smallest details. There were time zones, the type of handwriting in reports, and even phrases used by certain commanders. "The enemy is among us and he is smart," the general muttered, running his pen across the map. "But not smarter than me." Soon he noticed something strange. Some orders were arriving late. The signalmen swore they transmitted everything on time. In one case, a report signed by Colonel Antonov contained a phrase he never used. The general knew this. Antonov had been his cadet at the academy. Instead of his usual, "I consider it expedient," the report said, "it would be appropriate." A minor detail, but for Kovalev, it was the first clue. He started with Antonov. The colonel swore he wrote the telegram himself. But the general insisted on checking the typewriter and found it. A barely noticeable notch on the platen. A sign of replaced parts. Someone was either copying the machine or substituting the papers. Kovalev ordered all the staff's teletypes to be confiscated and personally interrogated the signalmen. One of them, a young corporal named Levchenko, flinched at the mention of Antonov. The general noted it. 3 hours later, Levchenko confessed, not to espionage but to stealing rations. The general didn't believe it. He knew anyone could steal rations, but that kind of fear only came from the terror of being exposed. He let the corporal go, knowing it was too soon. He had to wait. That night, when the headquarters was asleep, Kovalev, dressed as a private, went out on patrol. He knew that if there was a spy, he had to make contact, and somewhere in the radio shadow there had to be a receiver. He went into the field alone with a revolver and old boots. The fields behind the headquarters were silent. Only the occasional rustle of a bush in the wind and the distant bark of dogs from a faraway outpost broke the silence. Kovalev walked along a well-trodden path leading to a grove where an old system of abandoned trenches began. He knew that such forgotten, gloomy places were ideal for secret communication. Hidden under his uniform was a low-power radio direction finder, developed behind the lines and given to him personally. He turned it on. The needle began to tremble uncertainly. "So it's here," he whispered. He moved slowly, listening to every sound. A lone owl took flight from under his feet, and the general reflexively gripped his revolver. Soon the device showed a stronger signal. He was getting closer. Around another bend in the path, he saw a dugout, old and half-destroyed. The roof had caved in, but the walls still stood. Outside, everything was neglected, but Kovalev noticed the earth around the entrance had been recently disturbed. He hid behind a fir tree. Time dragged on. Finally, after about 30 minutes, he saw a shadow. A stooped figure was creeping towards the entrance. He looked closer. It was the same Corporal Levchenko. The man looked around and slipped inside. A minute later, a weak, almost inaudible signal came to life on the airwaves. Someone was conducting a communication session. The general rushed to the dugout. Leaping inside, in the beam of his flashlight, he saw Levchenko sitting at a primitive transmitter. As soon as the corporal turned, Kovalev struck. "Who sent you?" he growled, pinning Levchenko to the ground. "You don't understand," Levchenko wheezed. "I'm not alone." The general pressed the revolver to his cheek. Talk. Everything. Now. The orders came from a major. Major Serebrov. He was the one in charge. Kovalev froze. Serebrov was on his staff, one of the officers in the planning department. Tell me everything, or I'll make sure you never speak again. Levchenko nodded convulsively. He began to talk about the ciphers, about the plans left in the duty room that accidentally fell into Serebrov's hands, about how they transmitted data through short phrases disguised as official messages. When everything was written down, Kovalev led Levchenko out of the dugout, taking the transmitter with him. The next morning an alert was declared at headquarters. Units were put on combat readiness, and Serebrov himself was summoned for a report. That evening Kovalev sat in his office. On the table was the protocol of Levchenko's interrogation. Captain Smirnov stood by the door. The authorities are ready to await your order. The general slowly nodded. No, let them be for now. We've only just begun. If there are 3, there must be a 4th and maybe a 5th. He looked up at the map where red flags marked all the recent enemy breakthroughs. It all fits, he thought. But now we will be the ones to strike first. Major Serebrov arrived at headquarters exactly on time, as befitting a senior officer. His appearance, the impeccably ironed uniform and firm stride, aroused no suspicion in anyone except General Kovalev. The general waited for him not in his office, but in a room specially converted for interrogation, with no markings, bare walls and a single table. Please have a seat, Major, Kovalev said without standing. His voice was as cold as steel. General, Serebrov bowed. You wanted to see me? About the regrouping plans. Precisely, Kovalev replied. Only we'll be discussing other plans. Sit down. Serebrov grew slightly wary but obeyed. He clearly hadn't expected the questioning to begin immediately. Tell me, Major, where were you on the night of June 14th to 15th? At my post. I was preparing a report on artillery shell reserves. Kovalev slowly nodded and placed a sheet of paper on the table. Here, for example, is one of the encrypted messages signed by you. The problem is, on that night, the transmission of such documents was forbidden. Communication was restricted. Serebrov flinched, barely perceptibly, but it was enough for Kovalev. I don't understand, General. Even more interesting is that the message contains expressions atypical for you. I've studied your previous orders. This text matches neither your style nor structure. He leaned forward. Who wrote it for you, Major? Serebrov was silent. A thick tension filled the room. Then he suddenly straightened up and said, General, I won't sign anything without a lawyer. This is lawlessness. Kovalev smirked. This is war, not a civil court. You are under arrest on suspicion of treason. At these words, the door opened and 2 officers from the special department entered. Serebrov tried to stand, but Kovalev raised his hand. No, we still need you. Take him to the isolation cell. No interrogation. Let him think. When the door closed behind the major, the general turned to Smirnov, who was standing by the wall. If he wasn't working alone, his accomplice already knows. We'll set the bait. Let them think Serebrov has given everything away. By evening, a rumor was spread through the headquarters. Major Serebrov had allegedly named 2 other officers. It was a lie, but a deliberate one. Kovalev was playing his own game and knew that the real spies would now be nervous. They didn't make him wait long. That same night, the headquarters guard detained a communications lieutenant, Mesheryakov. He was trying to carry a radio tube, disguised as a sapper's tool, outside the building. Number 2, Kovalev said curtly, looking at the interrogation report. At least one more remains. He went to the window and stared into the darkness for a long time. But who is giving them orders? Who is the mastermind? The real source? And then he remembered. Recent radio intercepts contained phrases unusual for German ciphers, terms that could only be used by someone with a higher technical education and knowledge of their structure. I need to go to Moscow, he said quietly, or rather to the archives. This all started much earlier than we thought. 3 days later, General Kovalev arrived in Moscow under the guise of an officer on a business trip from the front headquarters. He wore the uniform of a lieutenant colonel, and his documents bore the name Helene, an old cover he had used before in special circumstances. Immediately after getting off the train, he headed not to the general staff, but to a nondescript building near Sretenka, the old archive of the radio control service. Here, within concrete walls and dusty vaults, lay the true history of the radio war, a history not even shared with army commanders. He entered a dark hall where a few elderly employees with thick glasses sat at tables in silent diligence. One of them, the head of Sector 6, stood up when he saw the credentials. "What exactly are you looking for, Comrade Lieutenant Colonel?" "Intercepts for April, May and the first 10 days of June. Frequency 182. Encrypted with the Bogolnik key." The department head's face twitched. Without a word, he turned, opened a safe, and a minute later, several thin folders lay on the table. Kovalev immersed himself in reading. He flipped through page after page until his eyes fell on an inconspicuous but terribly important detail. One of the intercepts contained the phrase, "The circuit is powered from the internal station through the cascade." It could have been anything, but the general knew. Cascade was the unofficial nickname for a secret laboratory at the Communications Academy in Kuibyshev. Legend had it that they developed jamming and direction-finding systems there. However, if a German cipher knew about it, the leak must have come from there. He urgently requested a list of Academy graduates currently serving in Army headquarters. An hour later he received a telegram. Captain of the Technical Service, Vasily Trofimovich Goldsman, was listed at the Southwestern Front headquarters. He had graduated from the Academy the same year Cascade was put into operation. And, most importantly, with honors. Very promising, his personal file noted. Too promising as the war had shown. Returning to the front, Kovalev immediately summoned Smirnov. "Where is Goldsman?" "Today he was in the repair workshop, checking equipment at the mobile communication station." "Put him under surveillance. No arrests. And find me someone who served with him in Kuibyshev. Someone must remember how he lived, who he associated with, what his habits were." A day later, Major Pogodin, a signalman who had served at the same academy, stood before the general. He said that Goldsman was dark and withdrawn but had a habit of spending long nights in the laboratory, using special access privileges to the codes. And most interestingly, he had been seen in close contact with a German philology professor, Kurtz, who later left for an unknown destination before the war began. The mosaic was coming together. Everything that had seemed random now took the form of a carefully planned operation. Goldsman, the brain, Serebrov, the transmitter, Mesheryakov, the logistician, Levchenko, the executor. And behind them, perhaps, stood someone else. Kovalev understood the moment of truth was approaching, but you could only seize the head of this snake by letting it strike and then cutting it off at its most vulnerable moment. He decided to announce an unscheduled exercise for transferring reserves along complex routes with false ciphers and to plant a leak in the network that Goldsman considered secure. He wanted to see who would respond, who would flinch first. The morning began with an announcement. The Southwestern Front headquarters was conducting a surprise drill, and all departments were required to urgently prepare their communication support plans for the transfer of the 41st Rifle Division through the Granat sector. It was a fictitious sector that existed only on paper, and the 41st Division had long been stationed near Voronezh with no planned movements. Nevertheless, the documents were meticulously prepared with signatures, ciphers and supply details. They were passed through the official chain of command until one copy landed on Captain Goldsman's desk. This was where Kovalev focused his attention. He gave no orders for an arrest. He was interested in the next link in the chain. According to the plan, Goldsman was supposed to transmit the false information through the already known system, possibly changing the route and cipher. A radio technical group had already established control over the frequencies. By evening they detected a transmission. It wasn't coming from the dugout or the mobile station. The radio source was located inside the military hospital attached to the headquarters. This was unexpected. Kovalev wasted no time. Together with Smirnov, he went to the location. The hospital was in a semi-basement, converted to treat wounded signalmen and radio operators. The corridors smelled of carbolic acid and iodine, filled with groans and muffled orders. The head doctor was shocked to hear that one of his patients might be an enemy agent. A swift check was conducted. In Ward 6 lay Senior Lieutenant Yakov Plev. He was considered shell-shocked and was almost non-communicative. According to his record, he was wounded during an air raid. But in his kit bag under the cot, they found a carefully hidden transmitter, disassembled and sewn into the seams of his uniform and under the insoles of his boots. He was waiting for a signal to connect the whole chain, Kovalev muttered. This man is the final spring. If he had transmitted the signal, the entire network could have been activated. Plev, despite his supposed condition, turned out to be in excellent physical shape. During his arrest, he tried to pull out a shiv hidden in his crutch but was disarmed by Smirnov. The interrogation lasted for 2 days. Pleve did not break. He remained silent, spitting in the faces of his interrogators, and only once said, "You're too late. Everything is already in Berlin." Kovalev didn't believe him. The radio signal had been intercepted. The cipher was incomplete. The agent didn't know he was being caught, but he knew time was against him. The general decided to strike. That same night, Goldsman was summoned to an emergency meeting. There, among trusted officers and witnesses, he was presented with a fake radiogram from German intelligence that read, "Pleve arrested. Goldsman under surveillance. Cease activity temporarily." The captain's reaction was instantaneous. Before he could utter a word, he lunged for the door and was tackled to the floor. His interrogation was the hardest of all. He didn't remain silent. On the contrary, he talked a lot, too much. He named names, dates, routes, even payment figures. He wasn't a fanatic, he was calculating. And when he realized the game was over, he tried to bargain for his life. Kovalev only said, "You're already dead, Captain. You just haven't realized it yet." The next morning, the spies were sent to Moscow. An investigation awaited them there. Back at headquarters, silence fell once more. No one knew what had transpired over the past weeks. Only Kovalev, looking at his map, mentally crossed off the flags. Network eliminated. But more questions arose. Who created this network? Who embedded them before the war? He said. This was not just a spy ring, it was an operation on a national level. And then for the first time he said aloud, "I need Berlin. Not for the war but for an answer." Upon his return to Moscow, Kovalev went neither to the main intelligence directorate nor to Stavka. He headed to a building known to very few, a house on the outskirts that housed the Prometheus Group. This organization did not officially exist. Its employees were listed as engineers, instructors, or consultants. But each of them was a hunter, one who pursued the enemy not on the battlefield, but in archives, laboratories, and headquarters. The general knew that if a thread leading to the creator of the spy network remained, only they could find it. In a windowless room, he laid out the documents, interrogation protocols, and a diagram of the network for the analysts. They began cross-referencing it with their database and almost immediately found a lead. A name mentioned by Pleve during interrogation, Kurtz, matched an agent known by the call sign Ernst. This man had operated in Spain in 1937, transmitting data on arms shipments to the Republicans before disappearing. Now it seemed he had returned from the shadows under a new name. Kovalev stared intently at the map of Europe. He knew they wouldn't let him go to Berlin, not now, not during the war. But he could find a link operating from there. The laboratory in Kuibyshev, Goldsman, Kurtz, they hadn't acted on their own. He proposed an operation to Prometheus, to insert a false defector who, under the guise of a Soviet officer dissatisfied with Stalin, would try to make contact with the German residency in occupied territory. 2 weeks were spent on preparation. A name, documents, a backstory, an accent, even habits, everything was scripted down to the last detail. The agent was found, Major Tikhonov, one of the best intelligence officers, fluent in German. He crossed the front line disguised as a prisoner, entered the enemy-controlled zone, and soon sent the first signal, contact established. The Germans showed interest. He was taken to Seidels, where one of the Abwehr's command centers was located. Tikhonov passed on data, false but convincing. Among it was information supposedly obtained from a disillusioned Kovalev, who had begun to doubt the war's purpose. It was dangerous. If it failed, Kovalev would be discredited. But the risk was worth it. 3 days later, a second signal arrived. A man introducing himself as Dr. Franz had arrived in Seidels. According to Prometheus's information, this was Ernst's contact. His handwriting, manner of speaking, and manipulation of terms all matched. He was interested in Kovalev's testimony and requested a meeting. It was arranged in a house with two-way surveillance. The moment Franz began dictating the coordinates of a dead drop for receiving radio codes, Polish partisans, whom Tikhonov had alerted beforehand, burst into the room. Franz tried to shoot but was wounded in the shoulder and captured. They found a key to an encryption case and a map with markings along the Eastern Front on him. The partisans handed him over to Soviet representatives. A week later, Franz, actually Kurtz, the former professor and one of the organizers of the spy network, was in Moscow. Kovalev was allowed to interrogate him personally. In the basement of an old building, windowless and silent, they were left alone. "Why did you do it?" Kovalev asked. Because I knew that you Russians would eventually find us all anyway, Kurtz sneered. But I wanted to leave chaos behind me. Chaos is where we begin to create order, the general replied quietly and walked out, leaving the enemy in silence. After interrogating Kurtz, the bustle of headquarters suddenly seemed incredibly trivial to Kovalev. He felt no triumph, only fatigue. In a month of hunting alone and in the shadows, he had strained himself and the few who had become his weapons in this hidden battle. But the war continued, and the war waged not on maps of offensives, but in the depths of folders filled with codes, was only just gathering momentum. Kurtz had not revealed all the names. He spoke in measured doses, with pauses, as if choosing whom to betray and whom to leave in peace. This irritated Kovalev. The general knew Kurtz was not one to tell everything. He was bargaining, which meant he still had leverage, another channel, someone else who could continue the work. And then the general decided on an extreme measure. He ordered Kurtz to be returned to the same basement, but to a bugged cell where, according to a cover story, another prisoner, a certain Captain Shmelev, had been placed. In reality, he was a Prometheus agent tasked with making Kurtz talk. At first, Kurtz was silent, but after 3 days, believing his cellmate's story, he spoke. And he gave a name, Magister. That's how he signed his radiograms. I don't know his face. He's a myth even to us. But he was the coordinator. Everything I built was his project. I executed, he planned. The name had surfaced before in the radio noise, once dismissed as interference. But now Kovalev heard the core in it. If Magister was real, the previously uncovered spy network was just a branch, a side project. He summoned Smirnov and said curtly, "We're going to Tula." Why Tula? Because one of the first undeciphered transmissions had come from there, back in 41. We didn't pay attention then. We should have. They arrived secretly. The communication station in Tula was still active as a backup hub for several fronts. There, among old radio towers in a dusty room, was an archive of magnetic tapes. And on one of them, listened to that evening, Kovalev heard the familiar voice, "Magister greets Cascade. Proceed to Phase 2. So, you were with us from the very beginning?" the general whispered. "From the summer of 41. They called in a voice identification specialist. It was a long, tedious process, but matches were found. Timbres, breathing patterns, accents were compared. And one of the reports concluded, the voice of Magister matches with high probability the voice of Professor A.E. Keller, a former communications consultant who left the USSR through Iran in 1939 and later disappeared. According to intelligence, he may have been recruited by German special services. If Keller is Magister, Smirnov said, then he didn't build the network in a year or two. He was laying the groundwork since before the war, under the guise of experiments, business trips, collaborations. Kovalev nodded. And I'm sure he hasn't disappeared. He's alive somewhere. And he knows I'm coming for him. He looked at the map. Points stuck out like needles. Tula, Kuibyshev, Seedles, Berlin. And in the very center, a void where Magister was hiding. But the general knew he wouldn't stay there for long. The hunt continued. October 1942. Battles raged at the front, but in the rear, in the quietest offices, another war was being fought. Kovalev, based on the findings in the Keller case, compiled a classified report stating, Magister's activities continue. He gained access to information from the archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he found letters sent in 1938 from Paris to Berlin. The handwriting was barely legible, but it used a rare crypto style, the same one found in Magister's encrypted radio transmissions. The handwriting belonged to Keller. One fragment of a letter read, "The experiment was a success. The subjects are receiving the signals. I have woven threads into the heart of their mechanism. If necessary, one can pull, and the entire defense apparatus will shudder." This wasn't a military report. It was a philosophy of sabotage, a strategy of infiltrating the living tissue of a foreign state. Kovalev crumpled the paper in his fist. His anger was not an emotion, it had become a method. At Kovalev's suggestion, a small surveillance group was created in the rear. Formerly part of the GRU reserve, it was essentially Kovalev's personal network. They monitored scientific institutions, employees with connections abroad, and, most importantly, anyone ever mentioned in the documents from Kurtz and Goltzman. Soon, another lead emerged. Engineer Yakov Yanovich Weinberg, a specialist in electromagnetic circuits. In 1941 he was evacuated from Leningrad and was now working in Saratov. His name appeared in Kurtz's report under the pseudonym Yin, mentioned as a valuable resource. Kovalev didn't go himself. He sent 2 trusted men, Smirnov and Major Tikhonov, the same one who had played the defector in Seedles. Their task was simple: check on Weinberg, understand his level of awareness, and if necessary neutralize him. Smirnov reported almost daily. Weinberg was withdrawn, worked nights, and avoided colleagues, a typical scientist on the surface. But in his laboratory they found a disguised transmitter, an almost exact copy of the schematic Kurtz had used. Weinberg didn't deny it. He wasn't a spy. He was a believer. A believer in science, in the theory that Keller had once taught in Leningrad as a hypothesis of systemic penetration. Weinberg thought he was working for an idea, not for the enemy. He was being used blindly, but he was being used. Did you know who Keller was? Tikhonov asked. He was a genius, Weinberg whispered. He said that a state is an organism. If you implant a foreign nerve into it, you can control its pain, its fear, its movements. That was enough. Weinberg disappeared. Officially, he died during a bombing raid. Unofficially, he was transferred to an underground isolation facility near Kaluga, where specialists from Prometheus were assembling a mosaic from people like him. That evening, Kovalev sat over Keller's letters. He reread the lines not as a document, but as a cry from the abyss. The writer did not just want betrayal. He wanted transformation. He believed he could rewire another country. So, you didn't want to kill us but to change us, the general whispered. But now you must learn that we are changing too. And I am your mutation. He closed the folder and ordered a group to prepare for departure. The destination was Königsberg. According to intelligence, one of Keller's last students and possibly Magister himself, was hiding there. Königsberg, November 1942. The city was as gloomy as a premonition, still holding the deceptive silence of the rear, unaware that the shards of the Great War would soon reach it. Under the name of Engineer Petrov, Kovalev arrived on the outskirts, in a district of old mansions now housing technical institutions of the Reich. The Prometheus group was already in the city, working under the cover of a fictional commission for radio equipment quality control. Information from Weinberg pointed to a building with Gothic-style stained glass windows on Cassandra Street. There, a young professor named Richard Berg supposedly taught physics. In reality, according to reports, he was a man connected to Keller since the late 30s. Kovalev didn't act immediately. He chose to wait. A day then another. Berg appeared at the institute every morning, always at a different time. He was accompanied by a woman with thin-rimmed glasses, reportedly a former stenographer for the German Philosophical Society. She never left his side. Everything was as it should be in the lives of those who knew too much. The general studied Berg not through a lens, but with the eyes of a man accustomed to reading gestures. Berg had the gait of a man of conviction but the eyes of a weary one. He rarely spoke, listened often, and when he looked at his colleagues, his eyes seemed to slide right through them. He exuded not science but memory. A memory in which Keller lived. And that meant one thing: Berg knew where Magister was. Through agents, a meeting was arranged under the pretext of exchanging technical ideas. In a house on the outskirts, posing as an engineer from Czechoslovakia, Kovalev spoke with Berg for almost an hour. He didn't ask directly, he probed every word, every accent. At one point, Berg said, "My teacher used to say to change the enemy you must become his mirror and then crack the mirror." It was a phrase from Keller's letters. No one but the chosen few could have known it. It became the key. Later, in a secure apartment, Kovalev conducted the interrogation. He used no torture. He only spoke of the front, of the children, of those who died because someone at headquarters had leaked a map. Berg listened in silence, then said, "You are mistaken. We are not traitors. We are evolution. We were not bought, we believed." "And now?" Kovalev asked. "Now it is too late." Berg gave the coordinates: a forest monastery near Tilsit. According to the professor, Magister was hiding there, using an ancient network of underground passages preserved from the time of the Teutonic Order. It was there, according to the data, that Keller's main archive was kept, including lists of embedded agents, communication schemes, and protocols for infiltrating enemy structures. The operation was prepared within 72 hours. On the night of November 18th, Kovalev's group crossed the neutral zone and, disguised as supply carriers, entered the monastery grounds. Silence reigned inside. The monks, whether real or in disguise, did not interfere. They looked at the soldiers with the resignation of those who had long understood they did not serve God. They found Magister in an underground cell, sitting at a table cluttered with books, diagrams, and, strangely enough, drawings of the human brain. He was old, nearly blind, but he recognized Kovalev. "So there you are," he whispered. "My mistake. My finest product. Kovalev didn't answer. He simply sat down opposite him and said, "It's over." But it wasn't. It was just beginning. The cell under the monastery smelled of mold, time, and something else, an old, almost palpable sorrow. Magister, or Keller as no one now doubted, sat upright, though his back trembled noticeably. His eyes were milky like a blind man's, but he saw everything. His long fingers with protruding joints touched the covers of old folios with the same reverence a surgeon touches a heart. On the table before him lay a leather tube. Inside was the last cipher. The one that had not been intercepted. The one that could have revived the entire network. "I am not a traitor," Keller said. "I am a prophet. You think victory is tanks and orders? I knew that victory is what remains in the minds of your children. We were fighting for their memory. You were killing." Kovalev stared at him, unblinking. "With ideas. With real spies, radio signals, betrayals. Because of you, operations failed, divisions perished. War is death. I simply gave it meaning." Keller held out the tube. "Here is what you were looking for. Burn it or keep it. You have become what I wanted to create. You are not just a soldier, you are an architect. That means you are my heir." Kovalev did not take the scroll. He stood up. "You are mistaken. I am not continuing. I am finishing it." Keller was taken away the next day. The archives found in the monastery were sent to be deciphered. Inside were schematics, names, maps, radio codes, even those transmitted through neutral countries and diplomatic channels. There was enough material for hundreds of cases, many of which were classified forever. Kovalev returned to Moscow in silence. There were no awards, no speeches. Even Prometheus vanished as if it had never existed. Only in the depths of an underground vault remained a folder, on which was handwritten, "Operation Cassandra." Inside was a single photograph of a gray-haired general with a firm gaze. The caption read, "Completed." He did not return to the front. He did not retire. He was transferred to another department, a temporary one as the order stated. But years later, in the archive of an intelligence school in the South, in a locked room, cadets still study lectures on the K method. He is not named. But one day when another lecturer asked who was the first, the instructor smiled and said, "There was a general. He wasn't looking for enemies. He was looking for those who wanted to become us, but for the purpose of destruction. He found them all, alone, and walked out into the night, leaving silence behind him. As do those who know how to win without firing a shot."